He thought it was just another stop, another moment where his badge meant everything and her voice meant nothing. The morning air outside the federal courthouse carried a sharp chill, the kind that settled into your bones and made every breath feel deliberate, visible in thin clouds that drifted between strangers who refused to meet each other's eyes. Traffic rolled slowly past, tires whispering against wet pavement, while the low hum of city life built a quiet backdrop to something no one yet realized was about to unravel. Officer Ryan Cole stood near the courthouse steps, posture rigid, gaze scanning with practiced suspicion, the weight of authority resting comfortably on his shoulders as if it had always belonged there. Then he saw her. She moved with quiet purpose, a woman in a dark tailored jacket, her steps measured, her expression composed, like someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. But in Ryan's eyes, none of that mattered. All he saw was someone who, to him, didn't fit. His voice cut through the morning like a sharp edge. "Ma'am, stop right there." Heads turned. Conversations paused. The subtle shift in attention spread like a ripple across the sidewalk. She stopped, slowly, turning to face him, her eyes steady, unreadable, not a trace of panic or defiance, just stillness. It was the kind of stillness that should have meant something. But Ryan didn't notice. He stepped closer, his tone tightening, his words louder now, meant not just for her, but for everyone watching. "What are you hiding under that jacket?" The question hung in the air, heavy, unnecessary. A few people nearby began to whisper, their curiosity sharpening into quiet judgment. Phones subtly lifted. Someone leaned in just a little closer. The moment stretched. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she simply looked at him, as if weighing something far deeper than the accusation itself. That silence only fueled him. "I asked you a question," he pressed, reaching forward with a sudden motion, pulling at the edge of her jacket. Fabric shifted. The sound, small but unmistakable, seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the stillness that followed. And just like that, the crowd had its answer, or at least, the illusion of one. A few murmurs grew louder. A man shook his head. A woman folded her arms, eyes narrowing as if the scene confirmed something. She already believed. Ryan straightened, scanning her again, convinced he had taken control, that he had exposed something hidden. But she remained exactly the same. Calm, grounded, unshaken. And that's when something subtle changed. Not in her, but in the space around them. Across the street, a black sedan slowed to a stop, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky. Near the courthouse entrance, a man in a charcoal suit paused mid-step, his hand moving discreetly toward his phone. Even the security cameras mounted above the doors seemed to hold their gaze a second longer than before. None of it registered to Ryan. He was too focused on the moment he believed he owned. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," he muttered, just loud enough for the closest onlookers to hear. But she didn't react. Not with anger. Not with fear. Only with a quiet breath, steady and controlled, as if she had already seen how this would end. And maybe she had. Because while Ryan stood there believing he had just uncovered the truth itself was already moving toward him, step by step, closing the distance in a way he couldn't yet see. And in that frozen moment, with the crowd watching and the city holding its breath, one thing became clear. This wasn't the beginning of his authority. It was the beginning of its collapse. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like the air before a storm when people feel something change but cannot yet explain it. Ryan Cole adjusted his stance, his jaw tight, his confidence still intact. But there was a flicker now, something small and almost invisible behind his eyes. He looked around, expecting validation, expecting the crowd to settle into agreement. But instead, he found hesitation. The murmurs were no longer certain. They were quieter, more cautious, as if the story they thought they understood had begun to slip through their fingers. Naomi Carter bent down with calm precision and picked up her jacket from the ground, brushing it lightly as though the moment itself had not touched her at all. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, controlled. When she stood back up, she did not look at the crowd. She looked directly at Ryan. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of clarity that made his authority feel suddenly smaller, like a shadow shrinking under direct light. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice even, steady, carrying just enough to reach him and no one else. The question was simple, but it landed heavier than anything he had said so far. Ryan let out a short breath, almost a scoff, trying to regain the rhythm he had lost. "You are not in a position to ask questions," he replied, louder than necessary, as if volume alone could restore control. But the words did not carry the same weight anymore. Across the street, the black sedan door opened. A man stepped out, tall, composed, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his tie and began walking toward the courthouse steps. Another figure followed behind him, speaking quietly into a phone, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Near the entrance, the man in the charcoal suit had already placed his call, his voice low but urgent, his gaze never leaving Naomi. Ryan did not notice any of it. He was too focused on proving a point that no longer needed proving. "Turn around," he said, gesturing sharply, his tone tightening again. "I am not asking you twice." But Naomi did not move. Instead, she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, slow enough that every eye followed the motion, careful enough that it did not trigger alarm, yet deliberate enough that it demanded attention. The crowd leaned in without realizing it. Even Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his instincts pulling in two different directions. She withdrew a slim leather case and held it in her hand, not presenting it yet, not revealing it, simply letting it exist between them like a question waiting for an answer. "Officer," she said quietly, her tone unchanged, "before you go any further, you should think very carefully about what you are doing." There was no threat in her voice. That was what made it unsettling. Ryan frowned, irritation rising again, pushing down whatever doubt had tried to surface. "You think that changes anything?" he snapped. "You think flashing some identification is going to fix this?" But even as he spoke, the sound of footsteps behind him grew closer, more defined, more intentional. The man from the sedan was now only a few yards away, his presence drawing the attention of those nearest the steps. A second later, a courthouse security officer appeared at the top of the stairs, scanning the scene with growing concern. Naomi finally opened the leather case. She did not rush. She did not dramatize it. She simply turned it outward, holding it steady at chest level. For a moment, Ryan did not look. He continued speaking, his words overlapping the silence that had fallen around them, until the absence of sound forced him to stop. And when he finally lowered his gaze to what she was holding, the shift was immediate. Not loud, not explosive, just a single, quiet fracture in the certainty he had been standing on since the beginning. Ryan Cole had seen badges before, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one flashing authority, each one demanding recognition. But this one did not look like any badge he had ever dismissed so easily. It was not just the seal or the lettering or the weight of the leather case in her steady hand. It was the way the world around him reacted before his mind could catch up. The courthouse security officer who had stepped forward moments ago suddenly stopped in place, his posture straightening, his expression shifting from routine alertness to something sharper, something unmistakably respectful. The man from the black sedan closed the remaining distance with quiet urgency, his shoes striking the pavement in measured steps that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. And still, Naomi Carter did not move. She held the identification in front of her, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as a simple fact that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Ryan's eyes scanned the details now, slower than before, his confidence unraveling not in a dramatic collapse, but in a series of small, quiet realizations that stacked on top of each other until there was no space left for denial. Federal, District Court, Judge. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and permanent, like something that could not be undone once understood. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time since the moment he had called her out, he was not the one controlling the narrative. Around them, the crowd shifted again, but this time there was no whisper of agreement, no quiet judgment aimed at her. Instead, there was distance. People stepped back, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create space, enough to separate themselves from what they now realized they had witnessed. A phone that had been raised moments earlier slowly lowered. A man who had been watching with folded arms uncrossed them, his expression uncertain. The story had changed, and they were all trying to catch up. Officer Cole, the man from the sedan, said, his voice calm, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be proven. You are going to step back. Ryan turned his head slightly, as if hearing the voice from far away, his focus still caught between the badge in Naomi's hand and the reality forming around him. I was just following procedure, he said, but the words lacked conviction, sounding more like a question than a statement. Naomi finally lowered the case, closing it with a soft, deliberate motion that seemed louder than it should have been in the silence. When she spoke again, her voice was unchanged, steady, measured, but now it carried something else, something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment. Procedure requires judgment, she said, and judgment requires clarity. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The meaning settled into the space between them, undeniable. Ryan swallowed, his gaze shifting, searching for something familiar to hold on to, but there was nothing left. The security officer stepped forward now, not toward Naomi, but toward Ryan, his posture formal, his tone careful. Sir, I am going to need you to step aside. It was not a request. It was not aggressive. It was simply final. The radio on Ryan's shoulder crackled to life, the sudden burst of sound cutting through the moment like a line drawn in place. Unit 12, confirm identity on Officer Ryan Cole, the voice said, clear and precise. There was a pause, a brief, suspended second where everything seemed to hold its breath again. Then another voice followed, lower, more deliberate. Confirmed. Stand down and await further instruction. Ryan did not move right away. His hands, which had acted without hesitation just minutes ago, now felt unfamiliar, uncertain, as if they no longer belonged to him in the same way. Naomi watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the same calm presence she had held from the beginning. Because this moment was never about raising her voice. It was about letting the truth arrive on its own. And now that it had, there was nothing left for him to control. The moment did not explode. It settled, heavy and irreversible, like a verdict delivered without a gavel. Ryan Cole took a slow step back, not because he chose to, but because something in the air had shifted so completely that standing where he was no longer felt possible. The authority he had carried so easily just minutes ago now felt distant, like it belonged to someone else, someone he no longer recognized. The courthouse steps, the flashing lights, the quiet crowd, all of it remained the same, and yet nothing was the same. Naomi Carter slipped the leather case back into her jacket with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, as if the reveal had not changed her at all, because for her, it had not. This was not a transformation. This was simply the truth being acknowledged. The man from the sedan moved closer, now standing at her side, his presence firm but respectful. Your Honor, he said quietly, his tone carrying both recognition and urgency. We are ready. Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her attention returning briefly to Ryan, not to confront him, but to mark the moment for what it was. Officer Cole, she said, her voice even, steady. This was not an isolated incident. The words landed differently than anything before them. They were not emotional. They were not reactive. They were factual, and that made them impossible to ignore. Ryan's brow tightened, confusion flickering through the cracks of his composure. What does that mean? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not with judgment, but with clarity. It means, she said, that what happened here today is part of a pattern that has already been documented. A quiet tension rippled through the space again, but this time it was not uncertainty, it was recognition. The man in the charcoal suit stepped forward, now standing just behind Naomi, holding a slim folder in his hand. He did not speak immediately. He simply opened it, revealing pages that had already been prepared, already been reviewed, already been waiting. Ryan's eyes shifted to the folder, then back to Naomi, as the realization began to form not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, unavoidable conclusion. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, the voice this time more direct, more controlled. Officer Cole, you are to remain on site. Internal Affairs has been notified. The words were clear. There was no room left for interpretation. Around them, the crowd had grown quieter than before, no longer engaged as spectators, but as witnesses to something far more serious than a misunderstanding. A woman who had been standing near the edge of the scene lowered her phone completely now, her expression no longer curious, but reflective. A man who had once nodded along with Ryan's authority now looked away, as if distancing himself from the moment entirely. Naomi adjusted her jacket, smoothing the fabric where it had been disturbed, her movements composed, deliberate, reclaiming not just the physical space, but the dignity that had never actually been lost. "You believed you were enforcing the law," she said, her tone unchanged. "But the law is not defined by assumption." Ryan exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling in. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Because for the first time, there was nothing left to defend. The man from the sedan glanced toward the courthouse entrance, where additional officials were beginning to emerge, their presence coordinated, purposeful, as if this moment had been anticipated long before it unfolded. Naomi turned slightly, preparing to walk forward, but before she did, she paused just long enough to leave one final truth in the space between them. "Respect is not granted by a badge," she said quietly. "It is measured by how you treat those who cannot demand it." And with that, she stepped toward the courthouse, not in triumph, not in anger, but in quiet certainty, while behind her, the structure Ryan thought he controlled continued to shift, piece by piece, into something he could no longer hold together. The courthouse doors opened with a quiet weight, the kind that did not draw attention but commanded it anyway. And as Naomi Carter stepped inside, the world behind her did not return to normal. It lingered, suspended, as if the moment outside had followed her in. The marble floors reflected the muted light above, polished and cold, every footstep echoing just enough to remind anyone listening that this place was built on decisions that carried consequences far beyond its walls. Naomi walked with the same calm rhythm, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, but now the atmosphere around her had shifted completely. People who passed her did not look through her anymore. They noticed. A clerk paused mid-motion behind a desk. A security officer straightened as she passed. A junior attorney, halfway through a conversation, fell silent as his eyes followed her down the hallway. Respect had not suddenly appeared. It had always been there, just waiting to be recognized. Behind her, the man from the sedan remained close, speaking quietly into a phone, his words precise, controlled, each sentence adding another layer to what had already begun outside. "Confirmed identification," he said under his breath. "Proceed with internal review." The phrase did not sound dramatic. It sounded procedural, and that was what made it powerful. Naomi reached the elevator and pressed the button, her reflection briefly catching in the polished steel doors. For a moment, the noise of the courthouse faded into something distant, something secondary. She adjusted her sleeves slightly, smoothing the fabric again, not because it needed it, but because it was a small act of control in a space where control had been challenged. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and as she stepped inside, the man joined her, standing just to her side, his posture respectful but attentive. "They did not expect it to happen like this," he said quietly. Naomi did not look at him immediately. She watched the doors close, the outside world narrowing into a thin line before disappearing completely. "It rarely does," she replied, her voice calm, thoughtful, not reflective of surprise but of experience. The elevator began to rise, the gentle motion almost imperceptible, but the shift it represented was not. Below them, Officer Ryan Cole remained where he had been left, standing in a space that no longer belonged to him in the way it had before. Inside the courthouse, Naomi's presence carried forward into something larger than the incident itself. The elevator reached its floor, and as the doors opened again, a different kind of silence greeted them, one that was not uncertain, but intentional. A conference room door stood slightly ajar at the end of the hall, and inside, figures moved with quiet purpose, folders spread across the table, screens lit with documents and timelines that had been building long before this morning began. Naomi stepped forward, her heels making a soft, steady sound against the floor, each step aligning with something that had already been set in motion. As she entered the room, conversations paused, not out of interruption, but out of acknowledgement. A woman seated near the head of the table looked up first, her expression focused but steady. "Your Honor," she said, rising slightly. "We have everything prepared." Naomi nodded once, setting her jacket neatly over the back of a chair, her movements precise, controlled. "Then we proceed," she replied. There was no urgency in her tone, no rush, because this moment was not about reacting. It was about following through. On the table, a file lay open, its contents organized, detailed, structured in a way that left little room for doubt. Names, reports, dates, patterns, and among them, one name that now carried a different weight than it had just an hour ago. Naomi glanced down at the file briefly, her eyes scanning without hesitation, before lifting her gaze back to the room. "Let the record reflect," she said, her voice steady, grounded, "that what happened this morning was not the beginning of this case." The room remained silent, attentive, every person present understanding the significance of what had just been confirmed. Because outside, it had looked like a moment. But inside, it was evidence. And evidence, once seen, does not disappear. The room did not feel tense. It felt precise, like every second inside it had already been accounted for before anyone took their seat. Papers did not shuffle randomly. Voices did not overlap. And even the quiet hum of the overhead lights seemed to settle into the rhythm of something structured, something intentional. Naomi Carter stood at the head of the table now, not elevated by position alone, but by the weight of clarity she carried into the room. She did not raise her voice to command attention. She did not need to. Every eye was already on her. The woman seated nearest to her slid a document forward, its pages marked with tabs, annotations, timestamps that traced a pattern not built in hours, but in months. "We have compiled 12 prior complaints linked to Officer Cole," she said, her tone professional, measured, each word chosen with care. "Most were dismissed due to lack of corroboration. Until now." Naomi rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, her fingers still, her gaze steady as she listened. She did not interrupt. She did not react visibly. But the stillness was not passive. It was focus. "Cross-reference the dates," Naomi said after a moment, her voice calm but precise. "Look for consistency in location and escalation." Another analyst leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he tapped on a tablet, bringing up a timeline that stretched across the screen. "There is a pattern," he confirmed. "Public confrontations, often in high-visibility areas, followed by reports that emphasize suspicion without evidence." Naomi nodded once, not in surprise, but in recognition. Because this was not new to her. It was simply being seen clearly now. Across the room, the man from the sedan stood near the wall, arms loosely folded, his attention moving between the data and Naomi's direction. "Internal Affairs has secured preliminary statements from 2 witnesses outside the courthouse," he added. Both confirmed the sequence of events. Naomi's gaze shifted slightly, acknowledging the update without breaking her composure. "And the footage?" she asked. The room paused for just a fraction of a second, not because the answer was unknown, but because of what it meant. The analyst at the tablet nodded. "Multiple angles," he said. "Street cameras, courthouse exterior, and at least 3 civilian recordings." Naomi exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of certainty. Evidence was no longer scattered. It was aligned. She reached for the file again, turning a page with deliberate care, her eyes scanning a report that now carried more weight than it had before. "This is not about a single moment of misjudgment," she said, her voice steady, grounded in fact rather than emotion. "It is about a repeated failure to apply the same standard of respect and restraint." No one in the room disagreed. They did not need to. The data spoke for itself. Naomi looked up again, her gaze moving across each person present, ensuring not just that they understood the case, but that they understood the responsibility that came with it. "We proceed by the record," she continued. "Not by assumption, not by reaction." The woman at the table nodded, making a note, her pen moving quickly but precisely. "Formal review will be initiated immediately," she said. Naomi gave a slight nod in return, then stepped back from the table, creating space not between herself and the case, but between herself and the process that now had to unfold. Because this was not about her stepping forward. It was about the system stepping into alignment with the truth that had already been established. Downstairs, far removed from the controlled environment of the conference room, Ryan Cole stood near the base of the courthouse steps, the weight of the morning settling into something he could no longer ignore. The radio on his shoulder remained silent now, but the absence of sound felt louder than any command that had come through it earlier. He shifted his stance slightly, his gaze unfocused, no longer scanning for threats, but searching for something that had already slipped beyond his reach. Inside the courthouse, Naomi Carter turned toward the window, the city stretching out below her, unchanged in its movement, unaware of the shift that had just begun within the walls behind her. She rested her hand lightly against the cool glass, not as a gesture of reflection, but as a moment of stillness before what came next. Because justice does not arrive all at once. It builds, piece by piece, through evidence, through clarity, through the quiet insistence that truth, once seen, cannot be undone. Down on the courthouse steps, time did not move forward the way it had before. It stretched, slowed, thickened into something almost unfamiliar, as if every second carried more weight than it should. Officer Ryan Cole stood exactly where he had been told to remain, but the position no longer felt like control, it felt like containment. His hands rested at his sides, still, uncertain, no longer guided by instinct but by the absence of it. The crowd had thinned, not dramatically, but enough that the energy around him had shifted from attention to distance. People no longer watched him to understand what was happening. They avoided looking altogether. A uniformed internal affairs officer approached from the far end of the steps, his pace steady, his expression neutral, not confrontational, not sympathetic, just procedural. He stopped a few feet in front of Ryan, maintaining a space that felt deliberate. "Officer Cole," he said calmly, "you are being placed under administrative review effective immediately." The words were delivered without emphasis, but they did not need it. They carried their own finality. Ryan blinked once, as if trying to process the sentence in pieces rather than as a whole. "Administrative review," he repeated, his voice quieter than before, stripped of certainty. For what? The question sounded less like resistance and more like disbelief. The internal affairs officer held his gaze, not unkindly, but without deviation. "For conduct observed and documented," he replied. "You will be required to submit a full statement." Ryan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in surrender, but in the recognition that the structure he had relied on was no longer holding him the same way. His radio remained silent. No backup voice. No reinforcement. Just the echo of what had already been said. Nearby, a second officer arrived, standing just off to the side, not intervening, but present, as if to mark the moment as official. Ryan glanced toward the courthouse doors, his eyes lingering there for a second longer than necessary, as if expecting something to reverse, to correct, to undo what had already taken shape. But nothing changed. The doors remained closed. Inside, the process had already moved forward without him. "You can remove your duty belt for now," the internal affairs officer added, his tone still even, still controlled. It was not a command spoken with force. It was a transition spoken with certainty. Ryan hesitated, just for a moment, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the belt, the weight of it familiar, grounding, something he had relied on without ever questioning it. And now, for the first time, it felt different. Not powerful, not protective, just an object. He unfastened it slowly, the motion deliberate, careful, as if moving too quickly might make the reality sharper than it already was. The officer beside him accepted it without comment, holding it in both hands with a neutral expression, as if handling something routine, something that did not require interpretation. A passing car slowed briefly at the curb, then continued on, its driver glancing only for a second before returning to the road ahead. Life outside the moment continued, unchanged, indifferent. And that was what made it heavier. Because for Ryan, everything had shifted, but for the world around him, it had not paused to notice. Up on the higher floors, behind glass and structured silence, Naomi Carter stood once more at the conference table, reviewing the latest updates as they came in. A staff member stepped forward, placing a printed transcript beside her, the pages still warm from the printer. "Preliminary statements from the scene," the staff member said quietly. Naomi glanced down, scanning the lines with practiced efficiency, her eyes moving steadily, absorbing each detail without hesitation. There was no surprise in her expression, only confirmation. She closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table, her fingers resting on it for just a second before lifting away. "Continue documentation," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "Everything must align." The room responded with quiet acknowledgement, each person returning to their role, their task, their part in a process that had already gained its own momentum. Outside, Ryan Cole stood without the weight he once carried, the space around him wider now, emptier, not because people had pushed him out, but because the truth had created distance on its own. And in that distance, there was no noise, no confrontation, no chaos. Just the quiet, undeniable shift of a moment where authority had been mistaken for control, and control had been replaced by accountability. Inside the courthouse, the movement of the case no longer felt like a reaction to what had happened outside. It felt like something inevitable, something that had been building quietly until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Naomi Carter stood at the far end of the conference room now, the large window behind her casting a muted light across the table where files, transcripts, and digital screens formed a clear, undeniable narrative. Each document did not stand alone. They connected. They reinforced. They told a story that no longer depended on interpretation. A senior analyst leaned forward, pointing to a section highlighted in the report. "We have matched 3 separate incidents with identical language in the reports," he said. Each one describes suspicion without verifiable cause, followed by escalation in public settings. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a shift in the room now, not in tension, but in certainty. "And witness credibility?" she asked. The analyst nodded. "Consistent. Independent. No prior connection between them." Naomi took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but out of confirmation. The pieces were no longer forming. They were aligned. "Then the pattern is established," she said quietly. The words did not echo, but they settled, final and precise. Around the table, heads nodded, notes were taken, screens updated in real time, each action feeding into a process that no longer needed to be pushed forward. It was moving on its own. The man from the sedan stepped closer, placing a sealed envelope on the table. "Preliminary authorization," he said. "Pending your review." Naomi glanced at it briefly before opening it, her movements controlled, deliberate, as she scanned the contents. There was no visible reaction, no shift in expression, only the quiet recognition that the next step had already been prepared. "Proceed," she said, closing the envelope and setting it aside. The word was simple, but it carried the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. Downstairs, outside on the courthouse steps, Ryan Cole remained in place, but the space around him had changed even more. The few remaining onlookers no longer lingered out of curiosity. They moved past him, their attention fixed elsewhere, as if the scene had already concluded in their minds. The internal affairs officer stood nearby, speaking into a handheld device, his voice low but clear. "Status confirmed. Awaiting transport." Ryan heard the words, but they felt distant, like they belonged to a different moment, a different situation that he had not fully stepped into yet. He shifted his weight slightly, his gaze drifting toward the street, watching cars pass, people cross, life continuing without pause. For years, he had moved through moments like this with certainty, with the belief that his role defined the outcome. But now, standing there without the structure he had relied on, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, just the absence of control. A black sedan pulled up once again, this time stopping closer to the steps, its presence quiet but unmistakable. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door without urgency, without display, simply performing a task that had already been decided. The internal affairs officer turned slightly toward Ryan. "We are going to continue this process downtown," he said, his tone steady, procedural. Ryan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to push against. Inside, Naomi Carter stepped away from the table, her role in this phase complete, not because the case was finished, but because it had moved beyond the need for her presence in this moment. She walked toward the window again, looking out over the city, the same streets, the same movement, the same rhythm that had existed before and would continue long after. But something had changed. Not in the city, not in the system, but in the alignment between them. She rested her hand lightly against the glass once more, her reflection faint but steady, her expression composed, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Because justice does not arrive with noise. It does not demand attention. It reveals itself in the quiet certainty that once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen, and once it is acknowledged, it cannot be undone. The city did not pause to mark what had happened, and that was the quiet truth of it all. Cars continued to move through intersections. Pedestrians crossed streets with coffee cups in hand. Conversations resumed as if nothing had shifted, and yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, something had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Outside the courthouse, the black sedan door closed with a soft, final sound as Ryan Cole took his seat inside, not as an officer responding to a call, but as someone now moving through a process he no longer controlled. He did not look back at the steps. He did not speak. He simply sat, his posture still, his expression distant, as the vehicle pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic like any other car on any other day. But this was not any other day. Because for the first time, the authority he once carried had been measured against something greater than assumption, and it had not held. Inside the courthouse, Naomi Carter remained by the window for a moment longer, watching the same streets from above, her perspective steady, unchanged, grounded in the understanding that justice is not defined by a single act, but by the consistency of truth over time. Behind her, the room continued to move with quiet efficiency, files being organized, statements being logged, every detail preserved not for spectacle, but for record. Because what had unfolded outside was no longer just a moment. It was part of a larger story, one that had been building long before anyone stopped to notice it. Naomi turned from the window and walked back toward the table, her steps measured, her presence calm, as she reviewed the final notes placed before her. There was no urgency in her movement, no need to rush what was already in motion. She picked up a pen, signed a document, with a single, deliberate motion, and set it down again. That was all it took. Not a confrontation, not a raised voice, just a decision grounded in evidence, carried out with clarity. Across the room, one of the analysts glanced up briefly, then returned to the screen in front of him, continuing the work that would extend beyond this day, beyond this case, into a system that, when aligned with truth, becomes something stronger than the individuals within it. Naomi adjusted her jacket once more, the fabric smooth, restored, as if the moment outside had never disrupted it at all. Because in reality, it had not. It had only revealed what was already there. She paused at the doorway before stepping out, her gaze steady, her expression composed, and for a brief second, the hallway beyond seemed to reflect that same stillness, that same quiet certainty. And as she walked forward, the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors, not as a declaration, but as a reminder. Not every act of power is loud. Not every moment of justice demands attention. Sometimes, the strongest shift happens in silence, in the space where truth meets consequence without resistance. Because he believed the badge gave him control. But that day, he learned something far greater. The badge could command a moment, but truth commands the outcome.